Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you see and hear us?
I can indeed, yes.
Mr. Wise, I'd like to ask you about your move to the security team in 2011 and becoming a security manager. This was quite a different role to those that you had held previously. How did you find the change?
I was very conscious of the role and what it undertook, and I did think quite hard about particularly the investigation side of that and, dealing with criminality, because that's not something I was used to. My role had always been quite supportive, and thinking about it, I wasn't sure if that would be the role for me, if that made sense. So I did think about it, but I went for the job because it was out in the network, it was dealing with postmasters. I had a lot of knowledge and experience I could bring to that role, and I was successful. So it was quite different, but I had the support of years of knowledge and experience to be able to apply to that role. So I knew I could take that with me and be quite useful in the role.
And what training were you given for the role?
When we initially started, it was just on the physical aspect of the role for the first few months, which were dealing with branches, robberies, burglaries, crime prevention, things like that. The plan, I think I started in the January, and in the March was when the training was booked for the investigation side of the role. So from starting in January up till March, we was given online learning around PACE and the codes of practice and other various things that we had to complete online. And we did that on the run-up until the course in the March. And I think it was a 3-week residential course, which was based down at Coton House in Rugby, which Royal Mail held as like a business centre. We had our own hotel on site and meeting rooms, everything was done in-house on site. On the first day of the course, we had to sit an exam based on the last 3 months of learning around PACE. And I think it was, we had to achieve 70% or 78% to be able to continue to sit the course. If you didn't achieve that mark, then you won't be able to continue on the course. And then it was I'm sure it was 3 weeks, because the middle week, the reason I say that is I drove myself the first week. The second week, my line manager took me down, and I'm sure I drove the third week because Leslie wasn't available. So that's why I think it were a 3-week course. But I'm thinking back, to 2011 now. But that's the reason I think it was 3 weeks.
And who provided the training?
It was in-house from the security team. So we had 2 people who trained us. There was a gentleman called Paul Southern, who was one of the financial investigators within the security team, and he was supported with an investigator called Paul, I can't quite remember Paul Whittaker. So it were the 2 of them who worked within the security team that delivered the training.
And as you have said in your statement for the inquiry, you had some involvement in the criminal investigation of Grant Allen and Kayem Ishak, whose cases the inquiry will be exploring further in future hearings. You say in your statement provided to the inquiry that you had some limited involvement in the cases as second officer in the case and attended their interviews. Can you just explain for the chair what the role of second officer involved in an investigation?
Okay. So when a case is raised, it's assigned to an investigator, and it's the team leader that makes that decision based on workload and geography. So they would assign the case to that particular investigator, and they would be first officer. So they would undertake the investigation, they would have all contact with the subpostmaster and make all arrangements. Now that first officer would choose a second officer, and again based on workloads. Within the North team, there were 4 of us that worked out of Manchester. It later moved to Bolton. So the lead investigator would decide, you know, who would go along and be second officer. And that was just really a role for on the day of the interview. So before the interview, we would probably get a little bit of prep on the background of the investigation and, you know, the circumstances around why they were being interviewed. It was very much setting up the room, greeting the person and the representatives, you know, making sure everybody were comfortable. During the interview, you were there as support, so if you felt there were a question that needed to be asked, you could interject with that question, or you would wait for the first officer to open up and ask you if you've got anything to add or any questions to add. So it really was case by case dependent how much input you had in the interview, depending on what the first officer had covered off in his questioning. The first officer would have an interview plan which he would share with you, so you had an idea of the questioning that and the lines it was going to go down.
And after you completed your training, was there a period of time when you only did second officer investigation work before you were elevated, so to speak, to being first officer in the investigation?
When we finished our training, we were mentored, probably I would say at least for 12 months, if not for 2 years. And I remember within 2 or 3 months after coming out of the training, I was, we'll say, tentatively given the first officer role, but closely monitored by the mentor, who you know, whereas in a normal investigation, the first officer would do the investigation, whereas your mentor, who would generally be the second officer for you, supported in that, so you weren't left to do it all by yourself. So I think it was a mix. We were second officer for more than what we were first officer for, but there wasn't a period of solely doing second officer. It was case dependent on the type of case, the complexity of that case, on whether you would be given the first officer for that.
Can you recall now the interviews with either of the individuals that I just referenced?
Not specifically. I can recall certain aspects, such as I remember going to Bradford Mail Centre where the interview took place. I think Mr. Allen's interview took place at our actual offices in Salford, but I can't remember specifics of the case or what questions were asked.
You've been provided with some further documents relating to their cases fairly recently by the inquiry. Has that assisted your recollection at all?
I've briefly looked through them because of the number of documents provided. I've not been able to, you know, read, you know, spend a particular amount of time reading them. It did prompt a few things. I can remember when I read it, I think it was the case for Mr. Allen where the interview was stopped because he indicated he didn't want legal representation. Then he suggested he might do. And because of that, we have to stop the interview and get agreement from a senior member of the security team to proceed. And I believe I read that occurred in that. So it brought back a little bit because I can remember we had to contact, at the time I think it was Dave Pardo, who were the head of security operations, to get authority to proceed, because Mr. Allen said, oh no, we will continue, I don't want legal representative, but we couldn't just do that. We had to get sign off from somebody more senior to allow us to continue because of those circumstances. I can't remember much about the case or the loss or what he was accused of. and similarly for the other gentleman. I seem to remember the one in Bradford, it was to do with stock and him adjusting or manipulating his stock figures. But again, it's all quite vague, to be honest.
To the best of your recollection, did you have any involvement in their cases after the interview stage?
No. The only involvement would probably be writing a witness statement to say I was there attending as second officer, but I wouldn't have any other involvement in the progression of that case.
You say in your statement to the inquiry that you never had any concerns about the criminal cases you were involved in while you were in the security team. Does that remain your position?
I think it does, yeah. I would say my current position is on the fence, if that makes sense, because there's been an awful lot of talk and evidence coming out about bugs and how flawed, particularly the original Horizon was. And I acknowledge that and I concede that, but what's not happened is the business haven't come to us and said, this bug, this branch, here's the bug, here's the data, here's how it materialises in the data. So my view is there's a potential for bugs, which means is it appropriate for convictions to be overturned? Then I would say yes, because that's the legal system, and if there's a potential for bugs, then that has to be explored. But equally, there's a potential for it not to be a bug. So I would say I'm on the fence at the moment.
Just in terms of your position at the time, so when you were involved in those cases, does it remain the position that you didn't at that time have concerns?
I didn't at that time have concerns, definitely.
Could we go, please, to your statement to the inquiry, that is WITN 09091901100, page 30, paragraph 87, please. On the question of your knowledge of bugs, errors and defects in the Horizon system, you say this: I have been asked by the inquiry whether I had or was aware of any concerns regarding the robustness of the Horizon IT system during my time working for the Post Office. To my knowledge, in all my career working for the Post Office, I have never witnessed a bug, error or defect while using the Horizon system, and I have never had any concerns. When I joined the Post Office security team in 2011, I became aware that a group of subpostmasters were claiming that Horizon was responsible for the losses they had suffered in branch. However, the message from the business was always that there were no issues with Horizon, and even during the start of the group litigation, the theme from the business was that POL would be successful in proving there was no issue with the system. We've talked about receipts and payments mismatch being the main criteria for the Horizon system helpline accepting ownership of a call. We talked about that earlier. Did you understand this to be a reference to a bug, error or defect in the system or not?
It's interpretation on what I mean by bug, error and defect and what other people may mean by bug, error and defects, and I liken it to my work laptop. The screen will freeze, I have to log out of Teams and log back in, I have to reboot my computer, I get a blue circle which means my memory's completely full and I have to get IT to resolve that. They're glitches that you live with. I wouldn't phone Microsoft up and say, what's going on with my computer, it's full of bugs. It happens, it gets resolved, it doesn't have a detriment on what I'm doing. So when I refer to bugs, errors and defects, I'm kind of referring to, I may have seen a screen freeze, I may have been in branch and had to reboot a base unit, but they're not what I'm meaning for bugs, errors and defects. I may have seen something at MBSC that doesn't look quite right or I can't explain, but that's passed over to HSH. That's what I'm saying is that's not concerned me. That's not given me reason to think, oh, there's something wrong with Horizon, because that's technology. And, you know, I trusted, and I think all people in the post office trusted the assurances that Horizon wasn't doing what we're saying it's doing now, you know, and I've got to work on that trust from the business. You know, I can only go off what they're assuring me. For example, if I buy a new BMW, I'm not going to ring up BMW the day after I pick it up and say, can you assure me that my engine's going to turn on when I get in the car? Can you assure me that my lights will come on? I buy it with that expectation that it's fit for purpose, and that's what's coming down from the business, that Horizon's fit for purpose. So when I refer to the bugs, errors and defects, these are the big bugs that I would say is capable of causing a loss, and that's what I'm meaning I've never come across. You know, I may have come across the smaller ones, I may have referred postmasters to HSH because I couldn't understand what was being presented to me, you know, through that postmaster, but that never gave me any cause to doubt the system. And that, coupled with the assurances from the business, you know, it just meant I had no reason to dispute that.
You've just referred to whether or not the system could cause a loss, but is it fair to say you knew from your time at the Network Business Support Centre that software issues with Horizon could cause discrepancies, on the basis that at least one case we've looked at, you referred it with that possible suggestion?
I don't know if I was aware, and still now I'm not aware of a lot of the bugs and how they materialise in the data or in the system, and certainly then I don't think I was aware or fully understood whether they could or couldn't. We would review what was in front of us, and that didn't follow the pattern to what we would expect. So I didn't know if that was causing the loss or not, and that would be referred over. So I don't think I thought about it that deeply then. Everything was on face value. You know, we took what was in front of us, and if we thought something didn't look right, we would pass it over to HSH.
You talk in your statement, and you've mentioned it again just now, of the message from the business being that there were no issues with Horizon even during the start of the group litigation. Can you help the chair with who this message was coming from?
A lot of the time from our head of security at the time, but even going wider than that, while the group litigation was going on, I remember there was quite a large meeting in Chesterfield with some very senior managers. I think one was Julie Thomas, possibly Angela van den Bogard, and they were assuring us that they expected that they would win on most of the counts at the group litigation, and this is at the start of the litigation. Within the security team, I think July 2013, when the second site report was published, that's kind of one of the trigger points from when prosecutions were, we'll say, frozen. And even then, the information coming out of Cartwright King, the legal team, the head of security, was we need to get a new subject matter expert. Once we get the new subject matter expert, we will carry on business as usual prosecuting, because that's the stance they took. You know, we can still prosecute, there's no issues with it. We just need to get that new subject matter expert. And year after year, meeting after meeting, that subject matter expert never materialised, but the message was still the same. All the team meetings, all the meetings with the whole security team, it was always that message that we need the subject matter expert and we'll start prosecuting again. Until that point, the cases were stacked and classed as inactive, I don't know, for a good period of time.
Thank you, Mr. Wise. Those are my questions. Sir, do you have any questions for Mr. Wise before I turn to CPs?
No, thank you, Ms. Price.
There may be some questions from call participants represented by Hudgels, Howe & Co and HJA. If I can... No. Ms. Ms Page, if I can come to you first.
Mr Wise, I act for a number of the sub-postmasters, including Mr Castleton, who sits to my right. When you gave evidence in the trial, Mr Castleton asked you some questions. Do you remember that?
I have some recollection, and I've refreshed my memory through the transcripts from the trial.
Well, it may be then that we don't need to go to the transcripts if you can remember that Mr Castleton asked you whether it was possible to perform transactions on Horizon without first logging in.
That's correct.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And you confirmed for him that that was not possible?
Correct, yes.
And that's obviously still correct, yes?
To my belief, yeah, you can't process a transaction if you're not logged on or if the system isn't logged in, yeah.
Yeah. Can you help with this? If the system had crashed or there had been a screen freeze, which meant that you had to reboot, would you then have to log in again before you could perform any transactions?
Yes.
Thank you. Then turning to another subject, and the last one I'll ask you about. We looked at that cash account issue that you successfully transferred to the Horizon Help Desk. A little earlier, Counsel to the Inquiry put it on the screen for you. And you'll probably be able to take it from me, I hope. I can certainly show you if necessary, that that call took place on the 13th of January of 2004. What we also saw earlier, and again we can go to it if necessary, is that when you dealt with Mr Castleton's call in the March, you and your colleague, who had originally dealt with him, Miss Pennington, saw his cash accounts, and they went back to a few weeks earlier, yes?
Yes.
And indeed, that first one that it went back to was, or at least the first time he had a problem with a discrepancy, was on the 14th of January 2004. So in other words, within a day of the cash account problem that you referred to the help desk.
Yes.
Presumably there was no way for you at the NSBC to put those two things together.
No.
And so, barring somebody having a miraculous memory, I remember that same day I took another call with a cash account discrepancy involving checks, that those two calls would never be joined up.
No, and if I explain at MBSC, particularly on a Wednesday afternoon into a Thursday morning, it was call after call after call relating to balancing issues, some with discrepancies, some with issues where they couldn't achieve a balance because they'd not followed process. So even a day apart, that could be 50 calls apart. So I could try and look at link calls to Mr Castleton's branch and see if I can look through to see previous calls, but it would give me everything that Mr Castleton had raised, so I might look through that and try and see if I could see any others, but I certainly couldn't cross-reference that to another branch. There'd be no way, unless I, like you said, I thought, well, this is very similar to one I dealt with the previous day, but I would say that didn't happen and was quite unlikely to happen.
Yes, I see. And so the fact that in that call that was transferred to the help desk, the fact that there seems to have been an update that came out in the November before that was causing the bug, that's not something that would have fed back or been shared around other branches experiencing similar problems, is it?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
No. Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ms Page. Anyone else?
I think there's a question or two from Mr Jacob.
Thank you.
Sir.
I have a couple of questions for you. Ms Price, I ought to say I act for 156 sub-postmasters in this inquiry. Ms Price asked you about paragraph 87 of your statement, where you spoke about the message from the business. And you say that that the position of the business, the message from the business was always that there were no issues with Horizon. And then you go on to say that even at the start of the group litigation, and you mentioned Angela van den Boogaard and I think Julia Thomas reinforcing that. In relation to always, when did you first hear the message from the business that you speak of?
I would say from joining security in 2011, because that was the point at which I become aware of the group of sub-postmasters that were claiming Horizon had lost their money. So in 2011, I became aware of that, but with that was the messages to say, you know, there's not an issue here, and we were even given instructions from Cartwright King on if a postmaster raises an issue to do with Horizon, you cover off by asking, I think it were asking what training they'd received, specifics on the issue. So it were all geared around disproving, if that makes sense. So those are the types of messages I'm referring to. It's not a email that says there is no issues. It's more minute than that. It's lots of things coming through. It's reading between the lines even sometimes that they don't directly say there's no issues with Horizon. It's right, this is what we've got to do to, you know, proceed to prove this. So it's not one message, it's lots of messages coming from different people within the business, different people within the security team.
Well, I understand that as a security manager you were conducting investigations from 2011 to 2015, is that right?
When Second Sight landed in July 2013, investigation still continued, but none really progressed to prosecution. So it's always slightly confusing on the timeline on what happened when, but for me personally, I was an investigator when I started in security in 2011 after my training until I joined the intelligence team in 2015.
And the point of my question is that you were specifically instructed to be dismissive of postmasters' allegations about the Horizon system in the conduct of your investigations because of the message from the business. Is that right? It must be right, sure.
I wouldn't say dismissive. I would say they try to give us tools to get round those messages from postmasters, so to be able to challenge them. So we were told you must do this, this and this if a postmaster says there's an issue with Horizon. And then that, so as an investigator, ultimately we're the fact finder, we pull all the information together, that goes to the criminal law team who ultimately make that decision. So we present the facts as we know it and they make that decision. So I don't think we were told to be dismissive. I think we were told to be guarded, you know, and cautious when postmasters were raising these issues. But as I said, the instruction was to cover off various aspects within the interview if a postmaster does raise that.
But we know now, don't we, that the message from the business was untrue. So this message tainted your investigations, didn't it?
It certainly did. And from my point of view, that does cut quite deep because, you know, had the business have been honest and open with what was going on with Horizon, then it could be said that we could address that in the courts appropriately. But as an investigator, we didn't get opportunity to be able to do that because of the messages that were coming down.
Now, one of the answers that you gave to Ms. Price a few moments ago when you were asked who delivered this message from the business is you said our head of security at the time. Now, one of my clients, Mr. Kelly, is here today, and he's very interested to know what individuals were responsible. Can you tell the inquiry who was your head of security in 2011, please?
When I joined in 2011, John Scott was head of security. Underneath John Scott, who was head of security operations, which was the strand investigation sits under, it was a gentleman called Dave Pardo. And then underneath Dave Pardo, there were the three operational team leaders. They changed so frequently, I'm not sure who was team leader when. I think John Scott left the business in around 2016, and the security team was broken up and fragmented, so financial crime went under one directorate, physical security went under with the property teams, and security operations fell under the network team, and the head of security from then on was a gentleman called Mark Raymond, who's the current head of security operations.
Thank you, that's helpful. You also say that this message was disseminated in team meetings, and
Yeah.
it would appear at more than one team meeting. Do you have any written records, memos or agendas of those meetings that the inquiry could see?
Between 2011 and 2013, at least once, possibly twice a year, we had meetings with Cartwright King, who were the criminal law team to all intents and purposes, and they produced workbooks, and before the meeting you'd have your handouts and your workbooks. So there is workbooks that have been produced from those meetings with Cartwright King. I'm not entirely sure. So we'd have, those meetings would be purely for the investigators. At least once a year we'd have a big team meeting with the whole of John Scott's security team, so that would probably 50 odd people. I'm not sure if there's any agendas, from those type of meetings. And then we had our individual team meetings, so there were the North team, South team, Midlands team, so we would have a North team meeting with our own team leader, and I don't know if any agendas from that would be available, but certainly from the meetings with Cartwright King, which were generally held at their offices in Birmingham, they would produce a work booklet for everything that is covered off.
And these meetings where the message from the business came out, how many people attended those meetings?
Again, the small team meeting would be, so in the North team, probably 7 investigators and the team leader. If it was across the whole security operations with Cartwright King, 3 teams of 7, so 21 people. If it's a big security meeting in all John Scott's area, there would be 50 people plus at those meetings.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm just going to ask if there's anything else I need to ask you. I don't have any questions for you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Wise, just one more from me, please. By the time you became part of the security team, I think your evidence is that you then knew that there was a group of sub-postmasters who were suggesting that the losses weren't caused by anything they had done or their staff, but was actually caused by Horizon.
Yes,
Yeah?
That's correct, yes.
And I take it from your evidence that from time to time between 2011 and 2015, you were part of what I'll call the interview team, either perhaps as lead investigator or second investigator, who interviewed some postmasters under caution.
Correct.
Right. First of all, have you got any kind of memory as to the approximate number of interviews under caution you conducted? And I don't want you to be precise, but just some kind of feel for it.
So my time from 2011 to 2013, and I use 13 because that's the point at which the prosecution stopped. I believe I had 5 cases that led to prosecution. There was probably 5 or 6 more that didn't, so possibly 10 cases where I was the lead investigator.
First of all, in any of those cases, so far as you can remember, did the person who you were interviewing raise as a potential explanation for an apparent loss a defect in Horizon?
I can remember one particular case, and it wasn't one that was prosecuted. It didn't go any further for various reasons, but she had issues with the communication of her Horizon system, I don't think in her area they had a SDL, which was the broadband lines, so the branch was run on what were called VSAT, so it were a satellite link to the network, and that made communication quite slow, particularly for banking transactions. So if a customer came in to do a withdrawal out of their card account, it would be a few seconds of the egg timer going round looking at the screen while the Horizon system communicated with the banking engine and back to authorise the withdrawal. So that particular person, you know, raised that and believed that that was potentially a cause of her losses. I went to the branch and I spoke to the staff, and I actually witnessed what was happening, which was communication, you know, and a delay in the banking transactions. And although I don't think it was a bug that caused the losses, there were potential that could cause a small loss if, for example, a customer was withdrawing £200 and the clerk paid out the £200, but because of the delay in communication, albeit only seconds, if the banking engine does not approve the transaction, it could be declined and the clerk's paid out money. So my thoughts were there were potential that mistakes could be made because of the delay, but I didn't believe that the delay in communications would cause the losses that were at the branch. But that's the only case that comes to mind where they raised issues with Horizon.
All right. Thank you for that. My last question, or last follow-up question then, is this. What instructions were you given, if any, from your superiors in the security team about how, if at all, you should investigate further if a person in interview under caution raised what I'll call a software issue about Horizon? What did they tell you to do if that happened?
We were told to ask specific questions around the issue. We were told to gather further information, as I said, around what training they'd received. I think there were 3 points to cover. I can't quite remember them all. Part of the process, what we could do is to ask Fujitsu as part of the ARQ request whether there's any issues at that branch over that time period, and when the data comes back we would ask them to support that with a witness statement which they would say whether there were any issues at the branch or not.
And was that instruction, if that's the correct word, as to what you should do in written form, or was that just discussed with your superiors, or what?
I think the instructions around the questions to cover off were quite probably in written form and issued as an instruction, either in email contact or in an actual document, you know, as part of the process.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your help, Mr. Wise. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for making your witness statement, and thank you for answering a good many questions today.
So I believe there is, in fact, one question on behalf of, Mr. Mullaney has one question, I think.
All right, sorry, I was jumping the gun.
Not at all, sir. I don't know if you can... Yes, my microphone's on now. It arises from your questions, sir, and it may be that it will assist Mr. Wise with his recollection in respect of questions you asked, sir.
Certainly.
Thank you, sir. Do you remember your involvement in the investigation of Eleanor Heard?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. She worked as an assistant at Stockport Crown Office.
Yes.
And her conviction was in 2011.
Yes.
You started in security in 2011 and you eventually interviewed her on the 7th of July of 2011.
Yes.
She pleaded guilty to one count of fraud by abuse of position on the 5th of October 2011.
Yes.
And then she was sentenced on the 11th of November to 4 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, with the requirement to carry out 200 hours of unpaid work.
Yes.
And her conviction was quashed following a hearing on the 27th of October 2022, when Post Office formally conceded the appeal and accepted that the reliability of Horizon data was and is essential to her prosecution and conviction.
I understand that's the case. I wasn't aware until recently, but yeah. I do understand that.
Now, The reasons for not opposing the appeal were that although Miss Heard admitted in interview to falsifying records relating to postage labels, do you remember she said that?
Yeah.
She had explained at the time that she was only doing it to conceal unexplained shortfalls.
Correct, yes.
So that pointed to an arising issue, didn't it, of unexplained shortfalls?
Not necessarily, no.
Could it possibly have pointed to an arising issue of unexplained shortfalls?
Potentially. I don't believe it did, but potentially, yes.
Yeah. Well, she was raising unexplained shortfalls.
Yeah, she also, in interview, admitted to giving customers £200 too much. She admitted to having a £1,000 loss because of a mistake she made. And when we went through the interview and worked backwards, we proved at every step that she wasn't entirely truthful with us. So I didn't believe that what she was saying was truthful. She was a clerk of 10 years' experience who had already approached the line manager because of a loss. So I think it was not reasonable, or it was reasonable to assume that she would have approached the line manager for unexplained losses instead of covering them up and committing fraud to cover them up.
Well, again, and what Post Office said was that there was no independent evidence of actual shortfalls in the accounts, and it seems that there was no investigation of how such losses occurred.
I think what you've said is the point. There's no evidence of losses in the account because she was covering them up. She wasn't declaring losses. So if there's no loss there to look at, it's difficult to pinpoint what's happened. And I think one of the questions that was put to her, because she did it in various stock units, and one of them were the Bureau de Change stock unit, which is a stock unit shared by a lot of team members. It's not specific only to her. And when asked why you would do it in that stock unit, I think her reply was, well, I think I were balancing it, so I think there might have been a loss in there. So it just, from my experience of many years working in the Crown and working with Crown staff, for me, it didn't stand up to what I thought a reasonable clerk, and she had proven herself to be that by raising issues in the past with the line manager. So my thoughts were that it wasn't correct, wasn't true what she was saying.
Yeah, and you made that very clear to her, you and Mr. Bradshaw, didn't you?
Yes.
She was raising issues about unexplained shortfalls because she was inflating the value of postage labels, as she maintained all the way through, to cover shortfalls that she couldn't explain. And she made that clear in the interview, didn't she?
She did. She made it clear that these shortfalls had been snowballing for the last few weeks. So we worked backwards for the last few weeks. In fact, we worked backwards for 7 months. So it just undermined everything she was saying. You know, we used the data, we used the reports from the branch to work backwards.
You used credence.
Yes.
You didn't get any ARQ.
No.
No, you used credence, and you essentially worked on the basis that she was guilty. And I'll take you to, if I may, just what you said to Ms. Heard during the course of interview. This is you and Mr. Bradshaw, and the document is POL 301147, please. And if we could go to page 8 of this document. Yeah. So when Eleanor Heard has been saying that she'd been inflating the value of postage labels to cover up shortfalls that had been occurring, Mr. Bradshaw said to her, you see, I think you're just lying to us, Eleanor. I think you're just, whatever you're just saying anything that comes into your mind, and you're not answering the questions, and you think that by just giving us any little old answer, we'll just say fine. Unfortunately, what Andrew's shown you needs an explanation. Just to remind you of the caution, you know, if the matter does go to a court and you give a different explanation, they're going to wonder why you didn't tell us the truth at the beginning. So would you like to tell us the truth now, why you rejected these labels and used them? And that's exactly what she's saying. Because I don't believe for 1 minute, and I'm certain Andrew doesn't believe for 1 minute, that you were having a daily loss of £60. So you just thought, well, I'll reject a few labels and leave the money. I don't believe that. Andrew doesn't believe that. So would you like to tell us the truth now? And she said, that's the truth. And then, so far as that is concerned, Mr. Wise, do you think that was, you've spoken about things being harsh in earlier days. Do you think that might have been harsh in any way?
An interview under caution isn't a pleasant experience, and we have to ask difficult questions, and the answers Elena were given didn't make any sense. We were proving her wrong, we were undermining what explanation she were given, so I believe there Steve was pushing for that explanation. And she maintained throughout that that was the truth. And what she was doing, just to explain, because I think you've described it a little bit wrong there, she were rejecting postage labels. So when a customer comes in to post a special delivery letter and you put the label on the item, it comes up and says, did the label print correctly? And she said no, so that rejects the label.
Yeah.
But she's got a genuine label to do that. And then she were inflating, she was telling the system that she was paying with postage stamps, that she was sticking stamps on, and then reversing that out at the end of the day. So,
and always to cover up shortfalls. And were you dismissive of her there? Because you said you weren't to be dismissive, but simply to work around what the training was and so on. Were you dismissive of her there, Mr. Wise, in any way?
I don't think so, because we'd looked at what her discrepancies were. We'd looked at whether she were having losses, and there were no losses to be seen. In the Crown offices, they have a procedure called the losses and gains policy to manage staff and allow them, to balance. And that's quite a lengthy procedure. You have to have a lot of losses to kick that procedure off. So there was no reason that Elena wouldn't raise that with her manager. She didn't have to put the money in like subpostmasters did. Subpostmasters were forced to make good the loss. But Elena worked in a Crown branch and she didn't have to do that. So it was quite reasonable to expect her to have approached the manager, as she'd proven she did in the past with £1,000 loss. So I wouldn't say dismissive. I would say we pushed her on it, and we wasn't convinced by her explanation. We'd looked at the history of losses and they just weren't there.
Yeah. And of course that was based on going to a manager, but it goes on, and we go on 2 pages, please, to page 10 of this. And we see there you talking about the Bureau, which you've already told us about. And Miss Heard said, no, that has got nothing to do with Bureau. And then your comment, second comment down, but you're rejecting labels in the Bureau stock unit. If your loss was in EE, why are you rejecting labels in the Bureau stock unit? You see what's happening here, Elena? You're telling us one thing, we're going back and disproving that. So in effect, you're lying to us. You're telling us one story, we're moving on to disproving that, and you're lying again and again. All this is doing is picking holes in your little story that you're telling us. Did you take the money out of Bureau de Change stock for these rejected labels? No. Why are you rejecting labels in the Bureau de Change stock unit if your loss is in E? Because Bureau had a loss. Bureau always has a loss. I was supposed to balance it that week, probably. Now, she was raising shortfalls. You didn't do any ARQ checks. You just relied on her admissions to inflating the labels, and you called her a liar during the course of this interview, dismissing her shortfalls explanation, didn't you, Mr. Wise?
We explored this shortfalls explanation, but we didn't believe that.
No, because she didn't go to a manager to tell you about it, but you didn't do any ARQ investigations, and you did no investigations beyond what you put to an interview.
We didn't do ARQ, correct, but we did do investigations beyond what was in the interview.
To do with Horizon data?
We looked at the credence data, we looked at the transactions that were put through. But if you can't identify a loss, there's nothing to... You can't identify something that's not there. If there's no loss there, you can't look at that and the circumstances around that loss, because what she was saying is she was hiding and covering up the losses. So unless she declares a loss and then later makes it good, there would be no footprint in the data, whether it's credence data or whether that's ARQ data.
But you rejected Miss Heard's explanation without going into the further data that was possible and available to you, didn't you?
Yeah, we didn't proceed to get ARQ data.
No. And that encapsulated the approach of your investigation team in this case, didn't it?
Not necessarily, because we'd done a lot of investigation work before we got to the point of interview. You know, we'd not got the ARQ data, but we didn't deem that necessary because we had the credence data and we had the supporting reports from the branch going back to the previous December.
And it was essentially, it had to be the fault of the suspect, barring an obvious explanation or error, wasn't it?
So just to explain...
What had happened must be the fault of the suspect, barring an obvious explanation or error.
The suspect committed fraud, whether that were to cover up a loss. Now, there could well have been a loss there. I don't think it's a loss that would be generated by Horizon. She's admitted to making mistakes. So even if she's making mistakes by giving a pensioner £200 too much, by processing an investment account deposit by £1,000 too much, you know, whatever the mistake is, if it is a mistake, then she's committed a criminal offence to cover that up. So my view was, and still is, because I've not seen anything to disprove that, is that Horizon didn't cause that loss. You know, we can get the data, we can look at that and go through the ARQ data. It's still available. So, you know, we can find out from Fujitsu how bugs manifest in the data, because they've still not told people like me, people that are currently working on Tier 2 investigations within the branch support centre, they've not been told how the bugs were manifesting in the data. But that's you know, we're looking at case studies into branches. Let's get that data and find out from Fujitsu how the bugs would look. You know.
So even without looking at the data, you're convinced that this couldn't be an Horizon case?
My opinion is, knowing what I know, not, but I'm open to look at that now at this point in time. I know we didn't do it then, but at this point in time we can look at that data now and see. You know, and that's the same for any case that's 2007 onwards. ARQ data is still available. We can still request that and we can still look at data.
A bit late now for Miss Heard, who was convicted and sentenced to a suspended sentence of imprisonment, though, Mr.
It is late for the ARQ data, yeah, but my view still stands. I've not seen anything to change my view on that, but I'm welcome to, you know, have a look at it to see if my view will change with any of them. You know, I'm an analyst. I base it on the data. You know, I can look at that and give my opinion. But you're right, we didn't get it in 2011. We just based it on the credence data.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Wise.
That concludes the questioning, Ms. Price.
Yes, sir, I understand so. We are back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock for Stephen Dilley.
Yeah. All right, then 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.